Specifically, I want to set the table by establishing a distinction right from the beginning. Most of the time when actually let me back up a step. How many of you are email administrators as your primary job? Okay, that was kind of a dumb question. How many of you are not primarily email administrators? So records managers, archivists, historians. How many of you work for government agencies or quasi-governmental agencies? Okay, that's about what I expected. Part of the reason for that breakdown, most of the people in here are from the commercial or non-governmental sphere, and most of the people here are email administrators. That's because if you work with the government and you say archive, that has a very specific legal meaning to most government agencies. The exact meaning will vary depending on whether you're talking about the state of Alabama or the state of Minnesota or the National Archives and Records Administration of the US federal government or the equivalent in an EU country. But all of those entities think that archive has a special meaning to it. But I'm going to let you in on a little secret. From an Exchange perspective, you know what an archive is? It's another mailbox. How many of you have been to sessions that Kamal Janardhan from Microsoft has done? Okay, she's got a session coming up talking about compliance stuff, I think tomorrow, that would be well worth attending. But one of the things that she likes to point out is that there's a reason why Microsoft normally refers to an archive mailbox, because that's what it is. So when you establish an archive mailbox in Exchange, whether you do it through Exchange Online Archiving or whether you do it on-prem, what you're basically doing is you're giving your user a second mailbox that looks and behaves almost exactly like the primary mailbox. The analogy that I like to use when talking about this is a mini storage. You have a house, you put some stuff in it. If you need more room for stuff, or if you have different stuff that you want to segregate for some reason, you go down the street and you rent a mini storage. It's not a house. You're not supposed to live in it, although I guess you technically could, except for the plumbing issue. But in terms of where you put stuff, it's just like your garage, right? It has a roll-up door, like your garage does. It may or may not be climatized or air-conditioned or heated, like your garage. And it's a place where you can transfer stuff from your primary living quarters to your secondary storage and back again as much as you want. It's not mediated. Nobody tells you what you have to do with it or how to transfer, what to transfer when. But you do have to keep in mind that it does have a storage limit. So with that said, I want to emphasize what we're talking about here in this session is Exchange Online Archiving as a secondary storage mechanism. We're not going to spend as much time talking about records preservation and the other kinds of very specific, archive-specific concepts that a professional archivist or historian or records preservation person would be interested in. So I want to start by setting out kind of what the terms of our engagement are here. What are we actually talking about when we talk about Exchange Online Archiving? Then I want to spend some time talking about how it works, because understanding the technology behind it and what's different about an online archive mailbox compared to a regular mailbox compared to an on-prem archive mailbox is really useful when you're trying to understand how to make best use out of EOA. Then we're going to talk about how you make best use out of EOA, what you do with it with clients, how it looks to end users, what kind of capabilities it gives you. Then we're going to get to the interesting stuff, starting with the discussion of how do you decide what you're going to archive in the first place, and then moving on to some best practices and notes from the field material. So I've already covered some of this. When we talk about archiving, most of the time what that means to most people is what you see on this slide. It's an organized, systematic, audited way to preserve content for a specific length of time. That specific length of time is one of the key differentiators between an archiving solution and a place to put stuff. How many of you have got retention limits right now that require you to keep archive data for more than, say, 2 years? Okay, keep your hand up if it's more than 5 years. More than 7 years? Does anybody have a requirement to keep anything forever? Oh man. So I have some customers like that and they hate life, right? Because what does forever mean in this context? Does it mean you have to keep your stuff around as long as Microsoft is in business? Okay, well, that's probably a pretty safe bet. For some definitions of what it means to have material retained for a set period, some of those periods can get to be pretty long. And we find that for customers where it is really critical that they preserve records for a very long duration, maybe just having them in electronic format is not sufficient. Okay. There again, it depends on your records. If you are the guy who's in charge of keeping records about where nuclear waste is buried, then yeah, keeping that only in electronic form, not a great plan, because one day there will be no electronics, but there's still going to be nuclear waste buried. So an alternate method might be a good plan. By the way, nobody in here is in that business by any chance, are they? Okay, I just thought I'd check. Maybe next time I'll check before I say something. So with that definition of archiving in mind, let's talk about what Exchange Online Archiving is. Although, I think you could get away with calling it Exchange Online Second Mailbox or Exchange Online Mini Storage. EOA is a separate, logically and physically distinct archive mailbox that is hosted in Exchange Online. So it is a counterpart to, but not a replacement for, the primary mailbox. You don't log into it separately. It doesn't have its own mailbox license. It's an adjunct or a sidecar, if you want to think of it like that. It will only ever exist once you have a user who has been synced into the cloud and where you have enabled that user for Exchange Online archiving. The magic of this is that as far as the user is concerned, they see another object in clients that support this, which is something we'll talk about in a bit, that looks just like a regular mailbox. They can create folders in it, they can drag things into it, they can delete things from it if you have that function enabled. So it looks just like a mailbox. But as far as you know, as an administrator, it can be a completely separate logical chunk of storage. There's very little difference in between how the on-prem personal archive feature works and how Exchange Online archiving works at an operational level. There are some significant differences in how you provision them and what has to happen in order for you to provision them that we're going to talk about. But this bullet here that says you can manage, move, and apply retention policies just like with a real mailbox, that's really important because your archive mailbox can be subject to all the same policies that you would apply to your ordinary mailbox. Now, quick show of hands. How many of you came here because you like this identical seamless user experience in EOA? That's what you're looking for your users. That's not very many hands. How many of you came here because you wanted unlimited archiving that you didn't have to pay extra for? Yeah, okay. That's the extra value meal theory of software pricing, right? So Exchange Online Archiving as a product, there are a couple of distinctions that it's important to draw. One is that this is not the same as the Exchange Hosted Archives product. Okay, that was targeted at a slightly different market segment, whereas EOA is intended to give you a way to give your users a container to keep more stuff, which, oh, by the way, can be subject to different retention policies so that you can keep that stuff as defined or as required by your organizational policies. One thing that's really important to keep in mind is that EOA is not journaling. For those of you that are using an on-prem journaling solution now, we still have to deal with the restriction that you cannot journal to an Office 365 mailbox. So if you want to journal, you're going to have to journal on-prem and then do something to move that journaled mail to the repository where you want it. Most of the time that doesn't come into play for Exchange Online archiving, and the reason for that is implicit in the name of what we call these mailboxes when they're on-prem. We call them personal archives. Journaling is typically a solution that organizations use when they want to make sure they're preserving all the mail that's flowing into and out of and around the organization. That's an archiving issue, but it's not an issue that you solve with EOA, okay, which is part of the reason why Microsoft has not moved more aggressively to enable the use of journaling with 365 mailboxes. So keep that in mind. If you're dependent on journaling because you have an on-prem archiving solution from a company such as Symantec or HP Autonomy, you may find that you need to keep that solution in place to provide the organizational level archiving, but you may want to supplement it with personal archives for individual users. See that a lot. That way users can manage the things that they keep around, but the organization is still managing the things that must be retained at the organizational level. So one very cool technical feature of EOA that I don't think gets as much play as it should is that the user mailbox that this personal archive is attached to doesn't have to be in the same place as the archive mailbox. They can both be on-prem, they can both be in the cloud, or you can have one on one side and the other on the other, as long as you have DirSync and as long as you have hybrid coexistence set up. Tremendously powerful because it opens up a bunch of scenarios that make it easier for you to get data into that archive in the first place and then do something with it later. And we'll talk more about those in the best practices section. I don't think this is an especially useful diagram, but I was told that my presentation needed more graphics, so there you go. It is useful in that it shows the relationship between the cloud and on-prem. And I would encourage you, if you're interested in the mechanics of how stuff moves around, really the important part in the middle is that green line that goes from Exchange Online Protection on the left, the one that says hybrid mail flow, to your on-prem org. Because once you have that working, and once you have the organizational relationship, which is a black line above it, then you're set to be able to deploy personal archives on one side or the other. Okay? But without that, and without the DirSync relationship that's shown down at the bottom, you can't even begin to provision these. So what does it require for you to be able to establish that connectivity in the first place? So another quick show of hands, is there anybody here who's not on at least Exchange 2010 SP2? I see one guy kind of tentatively raising his hand like he's hoping I won't see him. Okay, there's one. Anybody else? Come on, get those hands up high. All right, Microsoft is going to come collect you and take you for re-education shortly. If you've ever been to a timeshare pitch, then you know what it's going to be like when they come to talk to you about Office 365. They're going to make you a special deal. You get to go to Walt Disney World. You have to be on at least 2010 SP2 or later in order to be able to establish hybrid connectivity. Now, just from a supportability standpoint, and this would be a good opportunity for me to plug the session that Brent Allinger from Microsoft and I are doing tomorrow about supportability, where Brent is going to talk about some really interesting stuff that you may not have heard of before. So I recommend it highly. From a supportability standpoint, there's a good deal of risk in being on an old version of Exchange like that. So if you are on older than SP3, I would strongly consider moving forward. Leaving that aside, though, you have to have DirSync set up, and you have to have hybrid connectivity set up. Now, it's important to understand, you don't actually have to have hybrid mail flow set up, but you do have to have that organizational relationship set up because that's how we authenticate across the Great Divide. So wherever the mailbox is, wherever the archive is, in order to be able to authenticate between those two sides, we have to have the organizational trust relationship. I had a question in the best practices session that I did with Nick and Jeff and Siggy a little while ago, where a gentleman said, we're on-prem right now and our bosses want to put 35 mailboxes in the cloud. And is it worth doing all the work to set up hybrid? Well, it came to pass, they were already setting up hybrid anyway to enable archiving, right? So even if you don't think you want to put any mailboxes into the cloud, the work that you do in configuring hybrid so that you can move archiving to the cloud is a good future investment because it gives you a way to move mailboxes to the cloud if and when you want to do that, or to move resources, including archive data, from the cloud back to on-prem. Okay, let's talk for a second about hybrid. One of the big drivers behind EOA, one of the things that attracts people the most, I alluded to earlier, which is the idea that when you license Exchange Online, you're getting archiving for free. Now, you can, if you are a master of navigating Microsoft's licensing web pages, you can buy Exchange Online archiving by itself. But Microsoft is pricing things in a way that makes it compelling to go ahead and buy an E3 SKU, because then you get Office on the desktop too. That's getting a lot more interesting now that we're starting to see Office 2016 roll out the door, because what do you do if you have Office 2010 or even Office 2013 and you're looking at having to renew an EA or SA to get the new version? Well, maybe now is the time to consider whether buying those Office licenses, Office 365 licenses, makes more sense. So the lack of additional incremental cost for archiving is a big driver behind those kinds of decisions. If you think about what happens in a traditional on-premises archive environment, you have a certain amount of storage that you're consuming right now. As you add more data to your archives, you're going to be buying more disks, more places to put those disks, more power to power the disks and to cool them, more guards to secure them. You see where this goes. On the other hand, if you just ship all that to Exchange Online Archiving, you're not paying for any of that. You pay a predictable fixed cost. But there's a trade-off inherent in that, which is that you're also taking this information that may be very important to your business and to your ability to avoid going to jail, and you're putting it someplace else. So the question you should be asking is whether Microsoft is able to do a better job of maintaining and backing up and protecting that information than you can. Generally, that's a pretty good bet. Microsoft has got huge investments in their data center infrastructure, in their software, in their monitoring, in their security, that most customers can't match themselves. But the second white bullet here that says be aware of, this is really important because it may be the case that EOA does not meet whatever your organization's requirements are for true archiving. That's not something I can tell you standing up here because it's going to depend on what your requirements are. I have one customer, it's a state government, and I was flabbergasted to find out that every agency in that state is free to set their own records retention requirements. So agency A can say, we keep nothing. Agency B can say, we keep everything forever. And agency C can say, we only keep mail that's not going to make us look embarrassing if it leaks out to a reporter. And under the state law, that's totally legit. Other states have got different requirements. So I can't really give you a one-size-fits-all prescription other than to say, if you have specific requirements around duration or around what it means to preserve information, which is a legal term that has a specific meaning, then you need to be aware of whether or not EOA will meet that. Hybrid requires good connectivity. This is not news. Okay, but think about what happens when you access an archive mailbox using Outlook. You're really making a connection to a mailbox server somewhere. What happens if you have flaky connectivity to your primary mailbox on-prem? Does anything happen? Nothing usually? All right, I'll accept that as an answer. See, I told you I couldn't throw. You should have come sit up in the front. No, what happens is your phone will ring, right? Users will say, my Outlook is slow, email is down. Well, the same thing here, right? If you have poor connectivity, that will manifest itself by users having problems getting to the data in the archive, or more importantly, it'll manifest itself by users having trouble putting stuff into the archive because of the way that Outlook is written. And I'll talk more about that later too. So when you want to provision a new archive, you've got a user who has an on-prem mailbox and you decide you want to activate that user for Exchange Online Archiving. What actually happens? You turn on the archive, the magic of DirSync happens. The archive object actually gets created in the cloud, and we DirSync again. Why is that? I'm going to tell you in a minute. Click here, the answer may surprise you. This user got an online archive. What happened next will blow your mind. See, when people put those titles online, people click. You guys are just sitting there. I need better jokes. After that second DirSync is when the user archive is actually activated and available. So why does the process look the way that it does? Well, let's start off with getting the properties of an existing on-prem mailbox that doesn't have an archive applied. So when I do get mailbox and I look at the archive properties, what I see is a bunch of blank stuff. Archive GUID is blank. There's a quota, but there's no name for the archive. There's no database specified for the archive, and the archive state is none. So you can imagine that archive state none means exactly what it sounds like. There's no archive assigned for this user. If you look at the mail-enabled user object on the cloud side, you'll see that these properties have the same values. They're all either blank or in a default state indicating that no archive exists. So when I go into EAC and select this user and enable archiving by clicking that box or by using PowerShell, that causes Exchange to write some properties onto the user object. So the archive gets a URL for the archive mailbox store. It gets a name, which will be localized to the mailbox locale, and right now it says online archive plus a display name. It gets a quota, it gets a warning quota. Those may change from the default values you see, or they may not, depending on what your defaults are. The archive mailbox gets a GUID, and probably the most important out of all these is this last one, the ELC mailbox flags. The bit that indicates that this is a valid archive gets turned on. And then DirSync happens, right? But until DirSync happens, Exchange Online doesn't know that you have that you have archive enabled this on-prem mailbox. So it isn't going to do anything with the archive, because until DirSync for that user is completed, it doesn't know that those attributes have been changed. So you can wait for DirSync to do its thing on the default schedule or whatever schedule you have set, or you can force it. DirSync is going to sync those attributes, and then once sync is finished, Exchange Online picks up those properties and says, oh, okay, I see that this object has some properties it did not have before, and there's business logic in Exchange Online that looks at those attributes, and when they change, that triggers the creation of an archive mailbox in the store at the specified URL. So you might think, okay, now we're done, although I spilled the beans with that second DirSync comment earlier. The on-prem side knows that we have an archive. The mail-enabled user now has archive properties. But the on-prem mailbox, the loop has not been closed, right? The on-prem mailbox has not been updated to indicate that the archive has actually been created. I guess to extend my mini storage analogy a little bit, at this point, you have a deed to your house, you have a signed agreement at the mini storage, which you haven't driven home to give your copy of the deed, or sorry, the mini storage agreement to your family to tell them it's okay to put stuff in the mini storage yet. All right, I realize that's not the greatest analogy, but work with me. So right now, at this stage of provisioning, the on-prem archive is going to be marked as hosted pending, which just means Exchange knows that the properties that indicate that that mailbox has an archive have been updated. And it knows that DirSync is completed, but it doesn't know whether Exchange Online has made the necessary changes, because until those changes propagate back, it doesn't have any way to know that. So how does that happen? Exchange Online sets that status field to active, and DirSyncs it back. When the on-prem mailbox database sees that that field has changed to active, now the archive can be used. This takes a while. It is not instantaneous. It can take up to a couple of DirSync cycles. So now where we are is that both sides have all the properties they need. The archive GUID matches across both sides. Clients that understand the APIs that you use to talk to the archive mailbox can see that the archive mailbox exists. That archive store URL field is filled in, so they know what server they should be talking to. And they know the GUID for the mailbox, sorry, for the archive mailbox, so they know who to talk to. At this point, we're good to go. The archive exists, and it becomes usable to the user the next time they launch their client. So what can you do with it? Well, the first thing, I hate to be the one to break the news to you, but not only is there no Santa Claus, but also these archives are not actually unlimited. Oh, damn, did I say that out loud? Man, I guess that's really going to hurt my evals, isn't it? So, as a practical matter, these archives are not currently unlimited. Now, I want to be very careful about what I say, because I don't work for Microsoft and I'm not in a position to obligate them to anything. I think it is safe to say that Microsoft is aware that there is a strong customer demand for the perception of unlimited archives. I think it is also safe to say that there has been a lot of market pressure forcing everybody who offers mailboxes of any kind in the hosted world to increase their mailbox sizes. So if you look at the track record for what we've seen in storage quotas in OneDrive and OneDrive for Business, I think you can make a pretty good case that conditions are favorable for us to get increasingly large mail archives too. Now, having said that, I also think that from a self-preservation standpoint, you should consider very carefully if Microsoft came out tomorrow and said, yeah, you can have a 500 gigabyte mailbox, archive mailbox. Would you actually want your users to have that? I would say no. Because the counterpoint that we don't usually talk about when we are talking about archiving, everybody just sort of assumes that it's great to give users a way to keep their mail that doesn't involve using PSD files. The downside is that everything that's kept has to be discoverable. Because when you get a subpoena that says produce all your records for user X or in matter Y, if you have 500 gigabytes of user data per user in this online mailbox, you better be able to produce it. That puts a lot more strain on your e-discovery operations, your knowledge of how Exchange discovery and retention works. It exposes you to more risk the more stuff you keep. So weigh that when you're saying to your users, how much stuff do you want to keep? Users are probably going to want to keep everything because it's more convenient for them. You need to counterbalance that against the organizational risk you take on by keeping more stuff than you should. What I typically tell people, if you go with the standard quota limits, which, if I go back way too many slides, you can see here that archive quota is 100 gig and the archive warning quota is 90 gig. If you stick with those limits, then I think you'll be okay. As a practical matter, there's a soft quota of about 170 gig. And the reason I say that is that the mailbox size itself is quoted to 200 gig. But a portion of that has to be reserved for deleted item recovery, even in the archive. So the planning number that I typically use is tell people, as a practical matter, you shouldn't plan on being able to get more than about 170 gig into an archive mailbox. Now, because that quota limit is set to 100 gig, if you need to make your archive bigger than that, you have to call, or I shouldn't say that, you have to file a ticket with 365 support to have it raised. If you genuinely think that you're going to have a business need, not just a desire, but a genuine need to keep more than 100 gigabytes of archive data for individual users, then I would argue you need to be thinking about whether you're keeping too much data, because that's a lot. Now, in 5 years, maybe that won't be a lot because at the rate people generate email, 100 gigabytes of steady growth year over year maybe is not unreasonable. But I don't think I would start by planning on stuffing that much data into these archives right from the get-go. So in Outlook, which along with OWA is the only client that fully supports archives right now, the archive shows up as a secondary mailbox in Outlook. It shows up in the left-hand folder tree, just like a mailbox would, except that instead of saying mailbox paul@roboshow.net or whatever, it says online archive paul@roboshow.net. So the good news is there's very little you have to do to train users in how to use these mailboxes. They just show up and they can drag things to them, they can create folders, they can do all the things that they do with a normal mailbox. What makes that work is our old friend Autodiscover. So when Outlook makes its initial Autodiscover request, it's going to get back data in the manifest, and this label is very suggestive. Alternative mailbox. Remember I told you before that Kamal kind of admitted that the product team was thinking of this really as a secondary storage location, not as much as an archive as we think of, stone tablets preserved in a vault. But as an alternative mailbox. So it's flagged with a type of archive and then it has some data associated with it. And you'll see it if you do the Outlook connection status dialog, you'll see that there's a separate connection to the online archive mailbox. Now why would that be? Why would we have a separate connection? Well, it may not be in the same data center as your primary mailbox. They could both be on-prem. They could both be in the cloud. If they're both in the cloud, they could be in two completely different geographic locations, right? Or they could be one on one side, one on the other. So you'll see this as a separate connection object, which means that if Autodiscover does not work for whatever reason, if it's misconfigured or you're having Autodiscover problems, one of the ways that can manifest itself is by archive mailboxes not showing up when they used to. So if a user comes to you and says, hey, I can't see my archives anymore, as you're troubleshooting her machine, one of the things you should be looking at is, are you getting valid Autodiscover data back for the archive mailbox? Now, I mentioned that OWA was the other client that currently supports archives. It does the same thing that Outlook does, except that OWA itself doesn't do the auto-discover. In that case, the client access role is responsible for doing that. Now, to save everybody a lot of trouble, I tried to make a canonical list of all the other clients that don't support archives. I'm sure I missed a few. Outlook Express doesn't support them, for example. Outlook on Windows Mobile, you know, the old one, not Windows Phone, but the old one, doesn't support them. Basically, Mac Outlook's support for them is a little funny because the archives do show up, but they show up in a different place in the folder list than they do for Windows Outlook, which is a little disconcerting. And some of the behaviors are slightly different. I have not had a great experience syncing archives to Mac clients. I don't know if that's just a function of the relative maturity of Mac Outlook for Office 365, or if it's something underlying about one of the API, the EWS APIs that they use for archive access. But it has not been a brilliant experience so far, and I'm hopeful that they will continue to work on that in the future. One of the big advantages to having an archive, of course, is that you should be able to search it from a single point. So you can search your primary mailbox and include the archive when you search in both Outlook and OWA. That's one of the big drivers behind this, because if you have to separate search between those two, you might as well be using PST files from a user convenience standpoint, right? So one of the things that we don't have that I really, really, really want, we don't have the ability for me to pull a phone out of my pocket and search my entire mailbox, including the archive, from a mobile device. I will just put this out there. I have not used Universal Outlook, you know, the new Windows 10 client. Maybe it does that, I don't know. I have no information about that one way or another, but fingers crossed. So with all that said, one of the big questions that I face when I talk to customers about this is, okay, great, archiving is awesome, it doesn't cost us any more money, it does all these neat things. How are we going to get data into the archive in the first place? This is where the fights start. Because there are essentially three basic strategies for this. One is that you can make users do it themselves. How many of you have had successful, pleasant experiences with telling users they have to do something that they don't want to do? Yeah, that's what I thought. I'm not seeing anybody raise their hand. I'm trying to think how to phrase this delicately, and I'm just not having a lot of success. Sometimes it just depends on how big a stick you have to make users do something when they don't want to. So one stick is you could say, well, I have some good news and I have some bad news. The good news is I'm going to give you a 100 gigabyte archive mailbox to put stuff in. The bad news is, to encourage you to use it, I'm going to set the registry key that forces Outlook to not open PST files anymore in 30 days from today, so you better buckle up. Now, on the one hand, that will solve your PST problem one way or another. On the other hand, man, the crying and wailing and gnashing of teeth is going to be epic. But it's a strategy. There might be more friendly ways that you can accomplish that same goal, just depending on the size of your organization, how cooperative your users are, what other kinds of inducements you may be able to offer them, and so on. So that's one strategy. I'll call that the Chicago way, for those of you that have seen The Untouchables. Another way to do it is that you can use the mechanisms that are built into Exchange for archiving and retention policies. So the idea there is that you put retention policy tags and retention policies into place that will automatically take the mail that you're interested in keeping and move it to the user's personal archive. So with no action on their part, the mail just gets moved. Now, anybody want to take a guess at what the biggest hazard to that strategy is? 5 words. I can't find my mail. It's not bad if there's only one user. We had a guy in our other session who was about to deploy this technology to 40,000 mailboxes. Can you imagine what's going to happen when he turns those retention policy tags on and mail starts silently being moved to this archive mailbox that you can't see from your phone? So you go to look up the mail that you were looking for and it isn't there anymore, and you can't find it? Not going to be a great experience for anybody when that happens. Yeah? So that's a really good question. Is there a way to sync the online archive? And the sad answer is no. It's online only. Hey, that was a better throw. See, I am improving. Which is good and bad, right? I mean, the bad is that you can't effectively sync it for offline access. The good news is that it means your online archive can grow very large without the impact of having to sync a separate set of data down to the client, because that has its own set of problems that we run into when people start moving mailboxes or doing other things that generate OST resyncs. I think it's fair to say Microsoft has certainly gotten feedback from customers on both ends. They prefer that the archive be online only, but also there are other customers that would like to have it available in an offline mode. You know, will they do that? I don't know. But I think they've gotten that feedback pretty crisply. Then the third alternative, which can be used with either of these others in conjunction, is that you do something to move existing archives of mail into the user archive. Now, it's important that you understand what we're talking about here. Suppose that I'm Joe User and I have 10 gigabytes of PSTs, or you're my boss. My boss has a collection of PST files that contain every email that he has sent or received since 1997. Now, on the one hand, I routinely ask him, why are you keeping all that crap? Nobody cares what email you sent in 1998. Well, I might need it someday. Dude, that was 17 years ago. You haven't needed it yet. I don't think you're going to need it tomorrow. But sometimes it's hard to have rational discussions about emotional issues with people, right? So assuming that, and I'll just go ahead and throw him under the bus, his name's Scott. So assuming that Scott has got this very large collection of PST files that he insists on keeping, I have a couple of options to archive that mail. I think it hopefully is very clear to everybody that having that mail out of PSTs in an archive mailbox where it's being backed up and taken care of is a huge improvement over PST files. I don't have to worry that the PST is going to be corrupt. I don't have to worry that someone's going to steal the computer that it has the only copy of it. I don't have to worry that a future version of Outlook will not be able to read that 1998 PST format. All those worries just go away. But as with many other worthwhile end states, getting there kind of can be the challenge. So you can say, all right, users, move your own PSTs. You open the PST in Outlook and you drag across the things that you want and you do it yourself. That's kind of barbaric. It's mean to users, especially people like Scott who have got decades worth of accumulated email. So there's some automated tools you can use to help make that a little bit easier that we'll talk about in a minute. So let's start with user self-archiving. The pro is that for you administrators, it's really easy. You send out an email that says, hey, here's what we're going to do. If you have any questions, don't call me, call the help desk. All right, that sounds reasonable enough. It's very flexible because you have a great deal of flexibility in who has this policy or this restriction applied to them. You can, for example, say, if you have any email that's older than 10 years old in a PST file, we're not going to archive it at all. We don't care what you do with it. If it's between 5 years old and 10 years old, we will help you archive it. If it's less than 5 years old, you need to go through it and decide what you're going to keep and archive it yourself. So you could do that for one group of users, for your high-touch users, C-levels, or other people who need special care and feeding. You could do something different, right? Because this is not a technical policy. This is an organizational or people policy. So you have a great deal of flexibility to tailor it exactly the way that you want it to. And you can complement it with bulk import. So if you have users who have large quantities of PST data, you can have them get those PSTs into archiving without requiring them to necessarily do it themselves. The biggest con, honestly, is this first one I list up here. It's really hard to get users to do something that doesn't seem to generate any value for them. Okay, I'm facing this right now. I have a regulated public utility that has got about 300 gigabytes of random crap that they have archived as email in SharePoint libraries. And they want to archive it in Exchange. Okay, great. I see why they want to do that. So one of my early meetings with them, I said, okay, well, tell me about what you think a reasonable way to get people to go through and throw away things they don't really need. And they just started laughing. It was very demoralizing. I said, why are you laughing? They said, oh, you don't understand. Our users are not going to do that. That's why this stuff is in SharePoint in the first place. Because when we tried to get them to clean out their mailboxes, that's where they put it, right? It's like cleaning out your garage by throwing the stuff you don't want in your backyard and then complaining that your backyard is ugly. But it is what it is. So for these guys, there is no chance that they're going to get their users to go through and comb through this accumulated mountain of stuff. It's just not going to happen. Part of the problem that goes along with that is that not every user is careful or selective about what they choose to archive. Tony Redmond likes to talk about there being two fundamental personality types of email users. There are filers and there are pilers. I would add to that, I think there's a third type that I call hoarders. Right? Because there are some people who insist on keeping way more email than they can justify from a business perspective. And as I said, that adds risk when you do that, because if you keep stuff, then you have to be able to produce it on legal demand. If it's not there, then your answer can be, sorry, Judge, we don't keep records older than 5 years. That leads to this third problem, which is that if you have users who are not selective, and they're also not diligent about spending their own time to clean up mail for your convenience, then it's going to be really difficult to tell whether they have gotten rid of all the stuff they were supposed to get rid of. If you're interested, you can look up a court case called Microsoft versus Burst Networks from about 10 years ago, where Microsoft learned firsthand the very strong importance of having an enforced retention policy. Basically, they got sued. The judge told them to produce some records, and they produced what they thought was a complete set of records, and then Burst came back and said, oh yeah, look at all this email we have from people at Microsoft.com that is not in the records that Microsoft produced. Right? It turned out to be a major factor in Microsoft losing that court case. And there are many other examples. So keep that in mind when you're trying to decide, no pressure, but you might want to be mindful of that as you're deciding how you're going to put this data in the archive. So retention policies and retention tags give you a very flexible, very powerful mechanism to automate this. The second bullet is kind of the way I like to express it to non-technical users. These tags make it easier for users to do the right things, because most users want to preserve what needs to be preserved, and they don't want to keep stuff that doesn't need to be kept, but they don't necessarily know the difference, and they don't know what to do, so they save things because they think it might be important later. If you give them tools and teach them how to use them, that's going to make it easier for them to do what's right for the organization. Having said that, the downside to using retention policies and tags is that it's more work for you. You have to design the policy and tag set. You have to roll it out in a pilot. You have to test it. You have to verify that it's doing what it's supposed to. You have to monitor it to make sure that everything is being put where it's supposed to be when it's supposed to be. And this last bullet may or may not turn out to be a big problem for you, but not every client supports applying tags. So if you have users who live and die by their mobile phone or their tablet as their primary email device, you know what, right now, if they're using an iOS device or a Windows Phone device or an Android device, there's no way that they can put a retention tag on something. Now they can move it to a folder, which may have a default folder tag applied to it, and that may be nearly as good, but it's not the same experience that you get with OWA and with Outlook. And that may be an important factor depending on what your environment looks like. Yes, sir? Right. So that's a really good question. He pointed out that earlier I talked about users being able to move data between the archive and their individual mailbox. And your question is, what happens if something is tagged and it gets moved to a folder that has a different set of tags on it? Last tag wins. So if you have something that's in the folder that says retain this for 1 million years, and you move it to the deleted immediately folder, the next time the managed folder assistant runs, that mail's gone. That's why, I'm glad you asked that question, because that's why the difference between archiving and extra storage is so important. A real archiving system would preserve that data once you put it into the save it forever department. A real archive system is going to keep that around, right? Because the vendors who sell purpose-built archives understand that there are legal consequences to letting users randomly delete stuff that's supposed to be preserved. So the nice thing about retention tags and the way that they work is that once you define them, and I hope everybody can read this even in the back, you can see that there are some sample policies for 1 month delete, 1 week delete, 6 month delete, never delete, or instead of individually tagging the message, just use the policy that's defined for this folder, which in this case is the inbox. So you can see from within Outlook, it's pretty straightforward for me to take a message and apply a tag to it that indicates what should be done. So when you put default folder tags on folders such as the inbox or deleted items, it gets pretty easy to set up things so that mail that's been in the inbox longer than 30 days gets put someplace else. Mail that's been in deleted items after, say, 14 days gets moved someplace else, maybe deleted, maybe moved to an archive staging area. So it gives you a lot of flexibility. Now, from a Backstage perspective, when you apply a tag, what happens is that you get some metadata applied to the item that the Manage Folder Assistant uses to decide when it's going to get rid of those items, or when it's going to take action on them, I should say. Yes, sir?
If you've got a delete tag on something, it gets deleted, and the user says that recover it, does it still retain that delete tag?
It depends on where you put it. If the item's got an individual tag on it, and oh, sorry, I should have repeated the question. So if you have an item that's tagged for deletion and you delete it, what happens to the tag after that? Let's see if I can hit you from here. Watch out, guy in the green shirt. Nice. Wow. Yeah, I'll be a real winner in the ladies slow pitch softball league this season. When you delete the item, it's still got the original tags on it because these tags are just MAPI properties. But if you undelete the item and put it into another folder, then the tags that are appropriate for that folder are going to be there. Plus, if you allow it, the user can always go back and retag that item in the first place using the interface that I just showed. That's why I say tags are a great way to help users do the right thing, but it can be tricky because you only have limited ability to keep users from doing the wrong thing, either accidentally or on purpose. Right? If they don't understand what the tags are for, or if they're actively trying to get rid of some mail that they shouldn't get rid of, they can still apply those tags if you give them the ability to tag things on their own at all. The moral of the story is users can't be trusted, and you probably shouldn't give them mailboxes. That's really what it boils down to. Okay, so retention policies, what you're essentially doing is you're taking a set of tags and you're applying them to some object as a group so that users can select the tags, or you can select the tags that you want to have applied. I'm not going to talk much more about policies because there are other sessions that go into this in more detail, and rather than spending time getting into the nuts and bolts, I want to get back to talking about archiving. But I did want to mention the role of the Manage Folder Assistant. So the MFA is a piece of code that runs on the mailbox server. It's actually a mailbox assistant. And according to the work cycle that you have in place, it's going to run every so often to look for items that have reached the end of the period for the tag that they have defined. When that period has expired, in other words, when the item has reached the end date for the tag that it has applied, then it's going to do something. It's going to move that item to a folder, it's going to delete it, it'll take whatever action is specified in the policy. So the reason I mention that is that from a troubleshooting perspective, if you have items that are not going where you think they should, or something funny is happening, the first place to look is to make sure that the Manage Folder Assistant is running normally, that it's running as often as it should be, and that it's not throwing any errors or logging anything unpleasant in the event log. Because if the MFA doesn't run, these tags are not going to be enforced because this is the enforcement agent.
Does the tagging process at the end of the MFA run, like if the tag is deleted, MFA runs and deletes it, or is it?
Oh, good question. So, right, so if the tag says delete for 30 days, then you delete it today. 30 days from now, because the MFA is running daily-ish, according to the work cycle. So at the end of that 30-day period, the PR archive date, where did I put that? So archive date, archive period are what specify how long the item is supposed to be preserved before the action is taken, and the date specifies the timeout value, if you will. So when the MFA runs, the next time it runs after that period has been reached, if it's 30 days from today, then on May 34th, when it runs, it's going to fire, and then it'll take whatever action is specified. All right, I'm not even going to try to throw this as a spiral over all these people's heads. I just don't see that working out well.
Thank you.
Okay, let's talk about some best practices. First of all, PSTs suck, don't use them. Any questions? No. PSTs they're a legacy technology, right? We have them. We have to tolerate them. If we can get users away from using them, that's really performing a public service in a lot of ways. The issue is that you have to get that PST data and put it into Exchange Online archiving somehow. So one option is to let users self-migrate. As I mentioned earlier, you open up Outlook and you see your PST file and you take the important messages out of the PST file and you drag them over to the archive. Maybe a more user-friendly way to do it is that you also can use any one of a number of automated PST import tools to take user PSTs and put the contents into their primary mailbox and then use retention tags to move mail that's older than a certain date to the archive. That has the advantage of not requiring the users to do much of anything because some of these PST tools are pretty smart. They can go look on workstations, they can look on network file shares, they do some of them do a better job than others, but all of them have some kind of matching function to try to figure out who smithj.pst belongs to and to do the right thing. Yes, sir?
If you move the PST data into the regular mailbox and then use the tags, doesn't it get a new date stamp? So therefore, today's date, and if you wanted to archive something that's, say, PST data from a couple of years ago?
Yes, it does. So the way that you work around that is you import the PST data into a separate folder. This is a different tag, something like 7 days. So instead of going instantly, and I guess I should mention this too, there are some PST migration products, I know Dell's does this, and there are others besides, that will allow you to take PST data and put it straight into the archive without having to use retention policy tags. Microsoft's tool doesn't do that, right? So if you're going to use a solution where you want to import the data into the primary mailbox, what I would recommend is that you create a folder to put that stuff into and just put a very short lifetime tag on it so that once the data hits there, it'll stay there for 2 days or 3 days and then be moved to the archive. Oh, and I just gave away my third bullet. So your third choice is you can get a tool that's smart enough to automatically take that data from the PST and import it straight to the archive without having to double hop it into the mailbox and then into the archive. Yeah, Jason.
Microsoft is now offering a PST shipping option in Office 365.
I'm getting to that, man. I'm getting to that. Jeez. So when we talk about ingesting PSTs, you have some options there as well. One option that I see customers respond pretty well to is before you establish hybrid, before you set up archives in the cloud, you can give individual users archive mailboxes on-prem. And you can do this with Exchange 2010 if that's what you happen to have. Show of hands, who's still on 2010? Okay, good. So this is totally applicable to you. You do not have to be on 2013 for this to work. So you take the PST files, you archive enable the users who have PSTs, you put the PST data into their online archive on-prem. I guess that's, you know what I meant. And you leave it there. Then when you're ready to move those archives to the cloud, you can move just the archive mailbox across once you have hybrid coexistence set up. The nice thing about this is it means you don't have to wait until you have started your Office 365 deployment to start getting rid of PSTs, which means that you have a great deal more schedule flexibility. Option 2 is that you go ahead and turn on Exchange Online archiving for the users who are going to have PSTs, and you use one of the solutions I talked about before to grab that PST data and port it straight into the archive. Now, Jason mentioned something that I've been really excited about. I'm really glad to see Microsoft starting to light this up in tenants. But they now have a service that is dedicated to importing large quantities of PST data directly into Office 365. There are a couple of different ways that you can do it. The option that I like, because I had a customer not too long ago that had 45 terabytes of PST data that they wanted to import to the service. You send Microsoft a bunch of disk drives in a box. They get those disk drives, and of course they have to be a very specific type. But you send them those disk drives, and they plug them into a gadget in the data center, and it pulls the PST data out at wire speed and puts it into your Exchange mailboxes. Huge improvement over having to try to do it through network connectivity because you're not throttled to their data center, and you're not throttled. So remember, you can be throttled in two ways with 365. Your network connection between you and them can have throttling at the edge, and then depending on what the mailbox server you're talking to is doing, you can get throttled there too. This eliminates that. So it then becomes a question of, will your FedEx guy throttle you for giving him this enormous box that he can't pick up with disk drives? Yes, sir.
When they use that service, do they encrypt them, and what if the drive get lost? So it's email gets lost within the PST.
So that's a really good question, because his question was what happens, from a custody standpoint when you're moving this data around. And I'm going to be honest, I don't know the answer. I know during the preview, you could not send them encrypted drives. I don't know if they've changed that or not, because it's not lit up in my tenant. I mean, you would think they would have hooked me up, but not so much. Can you say that a little louder? Oh, cool. So what he pointed out was that there's a drive prep tool that forces the use of BitLocker with these drives. That's kind of a handy feature. By the way, how many of you are running BitLocker on your Exchange servers? Wow, that's not very many. Okay, you should. It does impose a performance penalty, but it's relatively small, and the benefit is if somebody steals your disks, or if they get lost, or you want to decommission them or whatever, it's a lot easier. So drive shipping is one arm of this service. The other is that you now have the ability to create basically an online migration batch of PSTs and ingest them into the service. So as of the time that I looked at my tenant, Microsoft hasn't finalized what the pricing and timing for this looks like, and I don't think the service descriptions for Office 365 have been upgraded to specify any particular turnaround or ingestion time. I'm sure that's going to be coming in time as they roll this out, but I haven't seen it yet. Yes, sir?
How do you label the PSTs to match the user, et cetera?
They have guidelines on the website for how you have to package the PST files so that they'll match up to the mailboxes. Yeah.
Okay. My question goes back to your previous slide. So what if I have litigation hold enabled on a mailbox in an archive mailbox, and I have retention tags? Which one will be applied first?
Litigation hold is always going to win, right? So if you have a retention policy tag that says delete this for 30 days, but the mailbox is on litigation hold, then when the item is scheduled to be deleted, as far as the end user is concerned, it looks like the tag fired and the item was deleted, but because you have single item retention turned on, it's still there in the authoritative copy.
Just a follow-up. Is it ever advisable to put all mailboxes on legal hold?
That's a really good question, and I've had other people ask me that, and my answer is it depends. So if what you want is to preserve a point in time is not the right word. If you want to preserve a canonical record of every change that got made to your mailboxes, and turning all mailboxes onto litigation hold will do that for you. I think from a performance standpoint, depending on how many mailboxes you have, you may find that over time that generates more problems than it solves. But I don't know what the upper limit is. In other words, I can't tell you, well, if you have 1,000 mailboxes, you can do that for 5 years and it'll be fine. But if you have 2,000 mailboxes, you can only do it for 2 years. Given that what you're doing, every transaction that generates a change in the mailbox is generating another record in the single instance, I can't talk. The single item retention store, I think there will come a point when you have too many items. It's just what value of too many, that I don't know. Yes, sir? 100 gig?
100 gig. We've run into it. They just recently upgraded all their mailboxes to 100 gig. Used to be 30 gig standard.
Okay, so that makes sense because that's what that 30 gig cut out of the 200 gig. That's why you get 170 real gig for archiving and then 30 gig for retention. That's only in the service though, right? The 100 gig limit. Okay. Oh, yeah, sorry, I didn't see you.
Is there any good way to report on the retention policy tags assigned to holders other than EWS?
That's a really good question. Is there any good way to report on what the existence of the tags, whether they're being applied?
We have, we're getting over the moving the notes folder to archive by
Right.
allowing a never move to archive personal tag. But we
don't want that personal tag to be overused, so we want to be able to report on where that tag is assigned. But it seems web services is the only way to get that.
The only way that I can think of that you can get that is with EWS. I'm going to play the Microsoft game and say that's actually really good feedback, and I would suggest that you go, Kamal and Ben are doing a session on compliance stuff in 365. I would go talk to them, just approach them after the session so you can explain what you just told me. I don't know that they'll add that in as an auditing feature in the service, but it seems like they ought to be able to do something better on-prem than what we have now. Yeah, in the back.
So you mentioned about archiving with 2010. What if you have Exchange 2007? What are your options?
Stop having Exchange 2007.
You have to migrate to 2010 or 13 before you even consider this?
Yeah. Now, because you can have mixed mode coexistence, you could deploy a handful of 2013 servers into your 2007 org and put the users whose mailbox, put the users who you wanted to have archive into there. I don't see any reason off the top of my head why you couldn't do that, although I think it would be maybe more complicated than moving everybody, and then after you moved everybody, then doing archiving. I'm not sure that it would be worth doing that just to get archiving capability. Yes, sir?
What's the licensing requirement for these features?
In order to be able to use them in Outlook?
No.
Or,
The tags and also on archive.
man, I hate when people ask me licensing questions. Because not only is there like a 50-50 chance I'll get it wrong, but then people will say, well, yeah, some guy at Ignite said blah, blah, blah to their Microsoft rep. So as best I recall it, I'm not a licensing guy, I didn't sleep at Holiday Inn Express, but as best I recall it, if you have E3, that includes retention policies and retention policy tags, but it doesn't include the fancy journaling, right? So for fancy journaling, you need Enterprise Cal, but I don't think you need that for the retention policy stuff. Jason, are you smarter about licensing than I am? Probably. Nod your head.
E3 includes that.
Okay, E3, yeah. Everybody should buy E3 all the time. That's typically what I tell people.
Also, the retail cost for online archiving is $3 per user per month.
Okay, for those of you who didn't hear that, the retail cost for archiving alone is $3 per user per month, which when you price out what it would cost you to give your users 100 gigabyte archives is probably pretty favorable. That number probably compares pretty well. So large archive provisioning, I'll just let you read the KB, but basically when the MFA is doing its thing, if you have ingested a bunch of data and then you let the MFA run, as I suggested earlier, for example, to move all that data to a folder, that's going to generate a big load on your servers. So think carefully about how you want to stage data import and how you want to stage the rollout of these tags to make sure that you're not going to be bludgeoning your server with extra load. Yeah.
I realize it's not deduplication of like files with the online archive, but in the scenario where you're importing a PST, and should some of the mail already be in the archive, when you were importing the PST, is there not an option for ignore?
So that's actually a very good question. How many of you remember single instance storage in Exchange back in the olden days? Yeah, get off my lawn. So PSTs themselves don't provide any kind of single instancing mechanism, and neither does Exchange any longer, but there are PST import tools that do, right? That's a vendor-specific feature that some tools have, where they'll look, and for every item that they're getting ready to import into an existing mailbox, they'll look to see if they've already imported that same item before. The implementation varies between vendors, and as I said, some vendors have it, some don't. But that's really the only way that you're going to be able to do that, because on the archive side, Microsoft is not able to make the decision about whether, if you've got the same item that's being archived into two folders, Exchange Online doesn't know whether you want two copies because they're two separate threads, or whether they just happen to be duplicates, so it doesn't attempt to dedupe that at all. Man, I got a lot of slides left. How'd that happen? Okay, bandwidth. However much bandwidth you have for the service, you're going to need more, especially if you're importing large numbers of archives. I don't think that's going to be a shock to anybody. Michael Van Horenbeek, or Michael Van Hybrid, as we like to call him, actually wrote a script that when you run it against your mailboxes will estimate how big an archive might be depending on the age limit that you set for the archives. So essentially all it does is walk through the target mailboxes and add up the message sizes to give you a rough estimate of how much data might end up being archived. So it's not precise, but it's a pretty good start. ExpressRoute, I know you've all heard about that. It may very well be a sensible solution when you're talking about importing. My impression of it so far is that there's enough infrastructure and enough setup and enough cost that you probably wouldn't deploy ExpressRoute just to migrate your PSTs and then turn it off again. It's much more of a long-term construction project type thing than it is a simple turn it on and then turn it back off. I alluded to this earlier. So one of the issues that we have with Outlook is that its threading model is still relatively ancient in some ways, and it distinguishes between things that you're doing in the foreground that are visible to the user and things that happen in the background. So, and I just realized that part of the text at the bottom is cut off, but I'm sure everybody can see where it says not responding. I know you've all seen that in Outlook before. So, for better or worse, Outlook 2013, Outlook 2010, I haven't tested this in Outlook 2016, and even if I had, it's a preview, so things could change. But when you're dragging messages around, Outlook treats that as a foreground operation. So if you drag 500 messages from your inbox to the archive folder, Outlook is going to assume that because that's a foreground operation, that it should do all those message moves on a single thread, and it should block any other foreground interaction until that thread is completed. What that means to you is you're going to see Outlook pop up with a not responding window title, and maybe even the whole window will turn white for a while it's doing its thing until it comes back. Really important that you forewarn users about that, otherwise you're going to get a spate of calls saying, look, I'm dragging my mail to the archive like you told me to, but every time I do, Outlook hangs. There's no fix for it right now. So you can work around this by doing things the Exchange way and using tags, because applying tags and moving items when tags are applied is a background operation. And it makes sense when you think about what happens. When the user puts items into a folder as a server move, that can be backgrounded. The tags get put on the server when those messages hit the folder, if there's a policy tag applied to that folder. And then if that requires a move, the MFA does that, and those changes just sync from the mailbox back to Outlook, which is also a background operation. So it's only when users are dragging things around on their own that they're going to run into this problem. Authentication. You may run into the case where, because you have problems with password sync or problems with ADFS, if your users cannot authenticate to wherever the archive mailbox is, but they can authenticate to where the primary mailbox is, then they will see this dialog. Now notice nowhere in this dialog does it say what set of folders cannot be opened. Right? It doesn't tell you I can't open the archive mailbox or I can't open the primary mailbox. It's just telling you I can't open some mailbox somewhere. I'm hoping that Microsoft is going to change both this behavior but also this user interface now that we're getting modern authentication for Outlook. For those of you that have not been to or have not heard about that yet, Paul Andrew is doing a session that talks about the Outlook authentication changes. It's super valuable. Essentially, we're going to get two-factor authentication with SMS. We're going to get all the authentication modalities that Office 365 supports throughout all of the Office applications, which is a huge both security and functionality improvement over what we have now. Okay, if you're using ADFS, where are my ADFS users? Okay, you already know this, and if you're using ADFS, if you don't have ADFS, you got nothing, because the cloud cannot proxy those authentication requests back to your on-prem ADFS farm for action. So if you are in the situation of having ADFS set up with online archives and on-prem mailboxes, this will manifest itself by, or ADFS failures will manifest themselves by users not being able to get to their archive, even though normal mailbox access works normally, because it doesn't involve that round trip with ADFS. On the other hand, if you flip the roles, if your archive is on-prem and your mailbox is in the cloud, you'll have the opposite result. People can get their mailbox, but they can't get their archive, which is actually not opposite now that I think about it. Okay, so where do you put your archive in the first place? A lot of discussion around this.
Sorry. On that last slide, you said that they could authenticate to archive only through UPN.
Right.
If you've set ADFS up to do an alternate like email or something like that, will that work as well?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. What I should have said here, instead of saying UPN, is you can't use like the old style domain WAC username. It has to be in the form of a UPN that can be used for authentication. So if you have the alternate email address defined, you can use that. Yeah.
Another question, is it possible to avoid the authentication prompt?
Maybe.
Sign on or something like
If you have ADFS set up properly for single sign-on, then your users should not be seeing a separate authentication prompt for the archive. If they are, that means that there's something about your ADFS or your authentication setup that's not quite right. I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Doesn't it have to do home realm discovery? And so you have to enter your UPN, so to do the home realm discovery, identify.
Yeah, that's the reason. So his question was, why do you have to put in the whole UPN? And the answer is because that's how ADFS is going to determine what realm it's supposed to authenticate against. That's another one of the changes that I hope is coming with the modern authentication update, but we'll have to wait and see what that looks like when it's actually released. So where do you put your initial archive? There are a lot of pros and cons. This would be a good theological discussion to have over a beer later about whether it makes sense to put data in an archive on-prem and then move it, or just wait until you can put it in the cloud. My answer to that is going to be that it depends on what's driving you to use archiving in the first place. If you're trying to get rid of PSTs on a time frame, if you're trying to make it so that you have archive and data preservation of some kind available right now, I would say go ahead and do it right now, unless you can get into the cloud quickly. If you already have hybrid operations set up or you can set them up quickly, then I think the benefits to only moving that data once and just having it go straight into the cloud are pretty compelling. But the nice thing is you can do mailbox moves with this archive-only flag to move the archive alone wherever you want it to be. So I guess the way I would characterize this is it's not set in stone. You can decide where you want the archive to be, and then if you change your mind later and want to move them, you can move just the archives without a huge disruption. Yes, sir?
How do you deal with shared mailboxes and archives? Right now, like I'll add a shared mailbox to my Outlook so I can see it, but I need to add the shared mailbox and the shared mailbox archive, or if I added the mailbox, would it add those tonight?
So when you add an archive, it's added to an individual mailbox, not a shared mailbox. So AutoDiscover is going to find the shared mailboxes. Well, it doesn't find them, you know what I mean. If you have auto mapping turned on, you're going to get the shared mailboxes you have access to, and you'll also always get the archive mailbox for your individual mailbox. So you don't have to do anything special to enable that.
We have shared mailboxes for teams, though, that have archiving enabled.
Okay. I guess I don't understand the question there.
It's not like shared, you just have a mailbox that you share with. You haven't actually flagged it as shared.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, in that case, that's a good question. I don't know what happens if you open an additional mailbox as an archive, because I've never seen anybody try to do that. Okay. Yeah, did everybody hear Jeff? You get the archive. Jeff said so. Take that to the bank. Okay, mailbox moves. We all love the mailbox replication service. When you actually execute the move, what's happening is that the move starts, it creates some folder hierarchy, copies everything over, and then finalizes the move, but it's not really finalized until DirSync runs. Remember, we talked earlier about the process that has to happen with DirSync to the archive location and then DirSync back from the archive location. And the same thing is true here. When you move the archive, one of the things you're moving and one of the things you're potentially changing is both the archive URL and that archive status flag. And so in order to take, not to take advantage of, in order for that transition to be complete, you have to wait for DirSync to complete as well. One thing that a lot of people don't realize is that there are many objects that are automatically synchronized between on-prem and 365 when you go hybrid, but retention tags are not one of them. So one of the early steps that you'll need to take once you're happy with your on-prem retention tags, before you get too deep into archiving is you will want to export those tags on your side and re-import them into the cloud, or vice versa, depending on where you're putting the bulk of your tag development effort. I'm sorry, so if you're doing hybrid?
You're doing a hybrid flow.
Mhm.
Can you sync your online retention tags with?
Okay, so if you're doing hybrid and you want to synchronize those two, that's actually what you have to use these scripts for. They're not automatically in sync at this point. Okay, migrating archives. I don't even know why I put this slide in here. How many of you are actually using separate retention policies for unified messaging right now? Or how many of you would if you were going to be using archiving? Okay, a few of you. So if you're going to do that, then keep in mind that when you move the mailbox, the retention policies for have to be set up on the archive side as well if you want them to continue to apply. That's also true if you're using in the cloud with on-prem mailboxes, which some folks will be. Okay, third-party archives. So the tricky part here is that there are a lot of different archiving solutions, some of which are no longer actively sold and supported, and there are a lot of different tools for migrating stuff out of them. For example, if you have Mimosa Nearpoint, there are several companies that specialize just in moving data out of that into the archiving system of your choice that's currently sold today. Wait 5 years and there's probably some products on the market that will not be in current support, and there'll be a different batch of products for moving things around. So these tools don't necessarily, these archiving solutions don't necessarily have built-in capability to talk directly to Office 365. You may end up having to buy something like Archive 360 or products from NetMail. There are several other companies that offer tools that will go from, say, Semantic EV into Office 365. Or from, pick your on-prem product. Sometimes what you will have to do, though, is you're going to have to export to PST and then import. That's sort of the lowest common denominator for a lot of these tools. Did you have a question in the back? Yeah.
Or if you're going to export that way, like import the PST into your mailbox and then move to Exchange Online, if that's going to increase the mailbox size a lot, would it be better to go with maybe the option you were talking about before where you send Microsoft the PSTs and have them import them?
I really like the idea of being able to import PST data through the drive shipping mechanism. And so once you get the data into PSTs out of EV or Attender or whatever you're using, then that gives you the flexibility to say, okay, I have a small number of PSTs that I actually have to archive, or I have all of them. So you can do it using any of the methods we talked about earlier, including drive shipping. I really, I think drive shipping is probably the best bang for the buck for large imports. And I expect Microsoft is going to see a huge uptick in activity there once they turn that on for all their tenants. Okay, this wasn't purple when I wrote it. I apologize because that's probably a little hard to read. But the data is in the cloud, but anytime you remove an object from AD, like a user account or like mailbox attributes, when that dir syncs, that has the potential to delete your archive, right? Think about what happens for a second. You have an archive mailbox which is tied to a primary mailbox. If you remove that primary mailbox, the archive mailbox is not a standalone object. It's tied to the existence of the primary mailbox, and so when you delete that, the archive mailbox is going to go into the deleted mailboxes subsystem as well. So keep that in mind. For those of you that can't read the purple text at the bottom, it says take this into account when you're talking about how you do disaster recovery. You probably want to consider the case where you accidentally delete something and then you need to recover just the archive. One of the areas where this comes into particular play is that in Office 365, you can have deleted or disabled mailboxes that don't require a license but that preserve the mailbox data. When you have a disabled mailbox that has an archive, it remains accessible as well. Okay, but if you delete it, once that mailbox is marked as deleted and has been removed, then the archive is gone also. This can also happen with OUs, for example. If you accidentally delete an OU that has user accounts, when those accounts go away, their mailboxes go away, and the archives that correspond to them go away. Generally, you can reconnect them if they're still visible but if they're not visible, you may have to restore them from backup. This last bullet is interesting. We don't really have time to talk about it in depth, but it's interesting to consider. What do you do when somebody leaves the company? Okay, I've seen a lot of different solutions for this, ranging from we just put that person's mail in a PST and burn it to a DVD and put it in a file cabinet, to we keep their mailbox around forever, but it's disabled and the password's changed. Archiving may give you an additional way to preserve data once somebody leaves the company, if you're careful. But the caveat then is that now you have this data that you want to be searchable, you want it to be indexed, you want to be able to find the mail that you want. But if you're commingling a bunch of old users' data in a single archive, you may find that it just makes it that much harder to produce the records that you actually need when you need them. Okay, MFC MAPI. This is a pretty useful troubleshooting tool because you can always use it to look at that triad of archive properties I mentioned earlier when you want to see whether policies are doing what you expect them to. So the date, the period, and the tag will show you what tag Exchange thinks is on an item or a folder. And then the period and the date will tell you when that tag is going to generate some kind of action against that item. Diagnostic logging, if you guys are smart enough to register to Ignite and make it to Chicago, you already know how diagnostic logging works, so I don't need to spend a lot of time talking about it. Except that this ELC library category down here is very useful for tracking whether or not items are being tagged and that tag is firing according to the MFA schedule. You also can look at logs that come out of the MRM component from the mailbox diagnostic log. This is a trick that a lot of people who have not read Tony's book are not familiar with, but export mailbox diagnostic log is actually very handy for getting a list of the actions that the mailbox assistants have taken against a set of mailboxes. Finally, you always have the option after you create a set of policy tags to force the manage folder assistant to run. And a lot of people don't realize that until you start the MFA for the first time, it's not going to do anything. So after you create your policy tags, after you get them applied, you'll want to start the MFA to prime the pump, if you will. But you always can start it on demand instead of waiting for the work cycle to fire. Normally, after you make a set of tag changes, when you want to see that those tags have been published, you'll run Start Manage Folder Assistant, give those tag changes time to propagate, and then use either MFC MAPI or the diagnostic logs to see whether or not those changes were actually applied the way that you think they were supposed to be. So I apologize, I ran a few minutes long, a lot of material to cover. The slides are, actually they should already be on Yammer, but if they're not, they will be shortly. And I'm happy to take follow-up questions if anybody has them.